All right, hello everyone. It looks like we've got a full house in here today, which thank you all for attending. My name is Alexandra Bartos O'Neill. I'm an associate at Orrick, Herrington, and Sutcliffe, and I'm just going to be a very brief moderator at the beginning of each of these sessions today, which is starting off with part one of a deep dive into affordable housing finance. And then soon followed, after an hour and 15 minutes of that, we'll be starting off part two of that same exact topic. I wanted to go over a couple of highlights of that structure before we begin, and then also introduce our wonderful panel that's going to be talking about these topics today. A couple of highlights for the first part of this deep dive into the sea of affordable housing finance. We're going to be talking about the current environment where we've been recently with affordable housing in the state of Oregon. We're going to talk about volume cap. We're going to talk about the local innovation and fast track LIFT program reset, and as well as general trends that we've been seeing lately in the state of Oregon and nationally. For part two, if you care to stay at 3:15, our panel will be talking about recycling bonds, 501c3 bonds as it relates to affordable housing, and P3 financings as well. So stay tuned for that. But most importantly, I wanted to very briefly introduce our panel here today. We're joined by Natasha Detweiler-Dabby, who is the Director of the Affordable Rental Housing Division of Oregon Housing and Community Services. We are also joined by Mike Schrader, Senior Partner at Orrick, Herrington, and Sutcliffe. And we're also joined by Steve White, who's a Senior Associate at Orrick, Herrington, and Sutcliffe as well. And then for part two, we will also be joined by Jessica Woodruff, who's the Chief Development Officer of Community Development Partners. Now, at the end of each of these sessions, we'll leave about 15 to 20 minutes for questions for all of you to ask wonderful and hard questions of our panelists, right? But otherwise, in the meanwhile, please hold your questions until then. Awesome, and I'll turn it over to our panelists.
Thanks, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces in the room. I'm tempted to ask, who have we not been on a conference call at some point with? We'll make that a rhetorical question, okay? I think we've been on conference calls with, I see a number of familiar faces, and I'm sure if I heard your voices, I go, oh, that's, anyway. It's been an amazing, amazing run in our bond counsel practice in terms of how we've developed in terms of financing, affordable housing financing, and how the capacity to do these projects and across the state has really, over the course of my time doing this, it doesn't seem as long as it has been that I've been doing this work with OHCS and Natasha and her great team and others, but it's really been amazing what we've seen in the last few years, mostly around the public investment, the gap funding, the soft funding, and just really the innovation and the capacity building that's gone on in our state. We clearly have some headwinds ahead of us, as you are all very, very familiar. We hear about those things secondhand. We're not developers and sponsors, but we see those and we see the trends. We're having some really interesting conversations, not only in Oregon, but around the country in terms of innovation. Orrick is a national bond counsel firm. We have a deep, deep bench who does affordable housing across the country, and so tremendous interest in 501c3 bonds, public-private partnerships, community investment, collaborations with employers, 501c3 bonds. What do you do when you don't have a private activity bond cap allocation and you don't have tax credits? What do you do? Can you still do a project? And that's an opportunity. Sure, it's a constraint, it's a headwind, but it's also an opportunity for collaboration. So yes, we have some headwinds, no question about it. Next slide. You are all familiar with this. You're putting together pro formas on this. I mean, what can you say about interest rates? They are, it's unbelievable. I mean, there's been times just, in our practice, it's like, well, they can't go any lower. And now we're asking ourselves the other question, like, oh my God, what happened on this? But there are some opportunities. There's some opportunities around some debt structuring, and there's things you can do to mitigate and other things around interest rates. We'll see where things go. We're seeing some very creative things around debt structures and other things that we'll talk about in part two of the session in terms of senior subordinate structures, cash flow structures, and other kinds of things, and particularly capital market executions as opposed to bank direct purchase transactions. It may be worth exploring and considering where you've got a little more flexibility in terms of your investor, at least on the debt side. We've heard a lot in conversation around increased construction costs, limited capacity. Don't try to do a kitchen remodel. That's just evidence of the demand out there right now on that. And then we're also hearing lots of conversation here about increased operating costs. What does that mean for a project? What do your reserves look like? Property and casualty insurance, just a host of issues and challenges, not only getting out of the ground and built, but operating going forward. What does that look like? A couple years ago, I think after Measure 102, we'll talk briefly about that, and the Metro Geo Housing Bond, City of Portland Geo Housing Bond, I think just on the back of the envelope, and the LIFT funding a couple years ago, I think we had well in excess of $1 billion of gap soft money on that. Now that number's diminished a lot, but we still have a lot of gap funding, so I don't want to be dramatic and say, oh my gosh, the world is ending, we don't have gap funding. We still have a lot of gap funding, which really is the game changer in Oregon as we look to our colleagues, partners, and bankers and developers in other jurisdictions. We are really uniquely situated in terms of the level and commitment of public funding to do these projects. And then, of course, the LITEC, the volume cap shortfall, which is the life of Natasha and Ty and others at the department as they look to revise that, the new QAP, the competitive process, the alignment between awards of volume cap, tax credits, and other resources by the department. And there's a lot of tremendously good work that's being done there. Let's turn to the next slide. I think it's important to talk, when we talk about headwinds, I think we also have to understand that we've had some, again, tremendous tailwinds behind us, and we'll share some data in terms of number of projects. And again, we're sharing this just from our perspective as a bond counsel firm. So we only see projects in this space, or almost all of them, that are in Oregon, private activity bond, volume cap, 4% tax credit projects, new construction and acquisition rehab on those projects. So just, how did we get here? We've had a tremendous run in terms of number of projects, volumes, capital coming into projects, and so forth. But it's important as we look at the headwinds to understand the tailwinds that put us here where we've had, frankly, a little higher expectations than we probably did a few years ago in terms of what we ought to be developing and how we ought to develop it on that point. So first of all, and I'll talk about volume cap. That's magic words that bond lawyers deal with on a daily basis on that. Historically in Oregon, we just simply didn't use our volume cap. And volume cap, and I'll talk about that in a minute, in terms of it's a cap that's imposed by the Internal Revenue Code on certain kinds of tax-exempt private activity bonds. Lots of big words there, but it's a limitation on the types of bonds you issue that generate tax credits for these multifamily housing projects. So Oregon traditionally gets around $400 or $500 million a year in cap. We simply didn't use it, and so you can carry it forward for 3 years. And you can essentially bank that volume cap. And so at the time we had Measure 102, Metro, Portland Geo Housing Bonds, the LIFT funding and all that, I think we all looked at that and we said, oh, well, we got lots of capacity to pair these resources with private activity tax-exempt bonds that generate 4% tax credits, and we've got lots of capacity to do that. Until a couple of years ago, we started looking at the pipeline and said, oh, we're starting to use that up. And last year, or earlier this year, I think we actually used up the last of our carry forward on that. But again, historically, we had underutilized that. We had some hopes last year that we were going to go from a 50% LITEC test to a 25% test. That didn't happen. Please continue to advocate. Call Senator Wyden's office. He understands and his staff understand this stuff really, really well. Hopefully we can get some traction on that and we can continue to do this traditional kind of funding. We're going to talk today about LIFT. I mean, LIFT was absolutely a game changer. I think we're in is this the 4th reauthorization of LIFT, Natasha? Yep. And we just got record levels of LIFT funding, and we're going to talk about that as well. Measure 102, the statewide voter initiative to amend the Constitution to allow these tax-backed bonds to be used in private housing development. Again, a game changer. It was fairly technical. I don't think it was opposed, but wow, it was really a game changer to take out the lending of credit prohibition in our Constitution to allow general obligation bonds to be issued for housing projects on this. Now, what we haven't seen yet is we haven't seen your local school district or your local city or other special district or others who have the capacity to do general obligation voter approved bonds to add a line in their ballot title that says workforce or affordable housing, which they actually can do under Measure 102. So these were all really game changers in terms of landscape for affordable housing. Of course, I mentioned the Portland and the Metro GO bond programs, again, that were enhanced by Measure 102. Again, historically very, very favorable low interest rates for a very long time. And then the other thing, when the Jobs Act a couple years ago, is we actually changed the tax credit calculation on 4%. 4% actually became to mean 4%. Go figure. As opposed to 3.19 or some moving target, 4% means 4%. And that was a nice, some found money, as I recall, on some year-end projects on that. So that was all very, very good. So I think in terms of, as I sort of look at these things, we've still got a lot of these tailwinds. We've still got, we've got this commitment to gap funding, be it LIFT, maybe there's another metro, maybe there's some local or even regional GOs out there to be had on that. Interest rates, we'll see where they go. We've still got that 4% now on LIHTC. So there's still some of these tailwinds, some of those elements are still there as we look forward and look how we innovate and create new financing models. We just had a session about dollars that are available for affordable housing. Now, we don't have MCOF anymore, municipal or market cost offset funds. So don't ask Natasha or Ty if you can have some MCOF, because there just isn't any. But there is gap funding out there for projects, and I know how committed the OHCS is in terms of really being good stewards of those funds to preserve projects on there. But we still have, again, we have a lot of money out there, federal money and other monies that are out there in terms of gap or soft funding out there. So again, I think some of those elements of that tailwind are still out there as we look forward. Next slide. Again, this is just, next slide. Okay, already. Okay, well, we're just gonna talk about production here. And again, this is just, this is just the perspective of your bond counsel or Oregon Housing's bond counsel in terms of projects. When I started, I've been doing affordable housing tax credit projects my entire career, which I hate to confess has been over 30 years right now. I started in the Midwest, where no one actually needed tax credits at that point. Land was cheap and everything else, and so the tax credits were just sort of a nice little add-on. I moved back home to Oregon a number of years ago and found out the tax credits were really critical. And gap funding was also essential on this. And so for many, many years, Natasha, what we do, 3 or 4 deals a year, bond deals a year. And again, to that point about not using your private activity bond cap, we just didn't have the gap funding to do that. And so that all changed with the LIFT program and these other gap funding sources, where last year, I think we kind of knew last year was probably going to be the high water mark. We did 40 bond financings last year. And we used to do, 3, 4, 5 a year. So that was incredible. And a lot of people in this room were part of that record level of production. And we hope to get back to that level, but it's going to take some different models and different structures to get us back to that level of production, or even increase that as we create some streamlined processes and funding sources and standardizations as we work through this. But again, this is just private activity bonds issued with volume cap for 4% tax credit deals. These are issuances primarily by OHCS, but by other local issuers, including Home Forward, Housing Authority of Washington County, Housing Works. There might have been a couple other local issuers in there as well. Since 2020, and these numbers I got these numbers from debt management on this, from Matthew and team on this, over $1.8 billion in issuance. 120 projects, and that's actually a fairly conservative number on the 120 projects, because we had several projects that were acquisition, rehabilitation, portfolio projects as well. So there's actually a number of other projects that count in there as well. Mostly new construction. We've slowed down in terms of the percentage of projects that are preservation versus new construction, because obviously a lot of the gap money's available only for new construction project or conversion projects on that. And again, in almost all cases, we were leveraging a number of other resources: LIFT, Metro, Portland, ARPA, all sorts of funding on that. And as you all know, the capital stacks can get pretty complicated, but those were the basic tools that we've used to provide, to do those deals. So it's really been, it's been a lot of fun. It's been great to go to all these groundbreakings and openings and those things. But we've got to rethink. We've got to rethink how we deploy these resources, how we combine public and private capital to push these projects forward and to finance those. And so a theme you're going to hear is innovate, innovate, collaborate. What was the term they used at the lunch session? What was it? Crazy ideas? Anyway, welcome. This is, yeah. So I think there are really opportunities, and we're going to come back to that theme of innovation as we move through. Wackadoodle ideas. That was the word. So yeah, let's talk about wackadoodle ideas and see what sticks and see what works and collaborate and try and work hard together and collectively to create financing models to continue to be good stewards of these public resources and create absolutely critical housing as we move forward. Let me just give you just a brief primer on private activity bond volume cap, because again, I think it's important to understand what cap is, how it works, how it's going to be awarded, and how you compete effectively for it. It's just simply, we're not going to be anymore on a first come, first served basis like we were. You got in the queue, you had a qualified project. If you were patient, you got volume cap. Maybe you still have to be maybe a little more patient going forward now, and some projects simply aren't going to qualify. So again, private activity bond volume cap is an overall limit on the amount of certain types of private activity bonds that can be issued under the Internal Revenue Code. It is a state-by-state allocation. I believe Oregon's allocations, it's north of 500 million. I think it's less than 550. It gets adjusted each year. It's sort of north of 500 for discussion purposes. In Oregon, volume cap is allocated. Each state gets to decide how they allocate volume cap to projects. Volume cap can be used for things like student loans, solid waste disposal facilities, mortgage revenue bonds, multifamily housing. In recent years, with the commitment of public funds to multifamily housing, almost all volume cap has been allocated to multifamily 4% tax credit projects, because that's the area of use of volume cap where you can generate something else in addition to tax-exempt interest, that is tax credits on this. And so almost all the volume cap has been allocated to multifamily 142D housing projects. So what happens each biennium, the legislature adopts something called the bond bill. And bond lawyers are very interested in what's in the bond bill, as you might imagine. And among the things in the bond bill is who gets volume cap and how much do they get. So what we have in Oregon is we have a statutory scheme every 2 years. And in this year, I think the bond bill is, I believe it's House Bill 5005. I hope I've got that right in that last paragraph. And what they said this year is OHCS gets $450 million of volume cap, and the balance goes to the Private Activity Bond Committee, a 3-person committee under the auspices of the Treasurer's Office, and they get to decide to do with whatever the residual amount is. If OHCS doesn't use their $450 million this year, then at the end of the year it goes back to the Private Activity Bond Committee, and they can either reallocate it to OHCS for next year's multifamily projects, or they can decide to allocate it to some other purpose of use. But at the end of the year, if we haven't used it up, whatever they say it has to be used for, it has to be used for. So we've had situations where there was a solid waste project in a rural town and they got a carry forward allocation, and then the project failed. That meant the volume cap went away and we lost it. That won't happen again, given we're in a volume cap constrained environment. Again, as noted, volume cap was historically underutilized, and so we were able to just bank this cap. It can be carried forward for up to 3 years. So we just had this nice war chest, if you would, of volume cap, this capacity to issue bonds and generate tax credits, which fortunately we used. So the good news is we used it. The bad news is we used it up, and so we're volume cap constraints like Washington, California, Texas, New York, and other jurisdictions. The difference in Oregon from those other jurisdictions, however, is our statutory scheme is set up, and particularly with what the legislature did in the bond bill this year, is set up to dedicate almost all of our private activity bond cap to multifamily housing. That's good for the people in this room. If you're trying to do a solid waste disposal project with tax-exempt bonds, that's not good for you. And we have lots of clients who are interested in doing that, but simply it's not available because as a policy matter, the state of Oregon has said we're going to use all or most of our volume cap for multifamily housing projects and generate tax credits with that. I think the other thing worth noting, and I really praise my client, OHCS, and the team there for some foresight on this, in addition to the decision about how to allocate volume cap in this year's bond bill, we also had something called Senate Bill 225, which we sort of viewed as mostly a technical fix. But what it did, it said for volume cap that's awarded statutorily to OHCS, they are entitled now to collaborate with local housing authorities who may be doing their own projects or otherwise have a need to issue private activity bonds directly. And so now, rather than have this competitive process where OHCS has statutory cap and PABC has the residual amount of that, you can now simply go to OHCS and say, I think in this case it makes sense for the local issuer to issue volume cap. And in fact, under Senate Bill 225, OHCS now gets to manage and be thoughtful, so you don't have competing processes for volume cap. And there's some other technical fixes in 225 in terms of interim authority between legislative sessions and signing of the bond bill and so forth. Anyway, it's a very, very thoughtful technical fix. I think when we were looking at it, I think there's only one other state that is that creative. I think maybe it's West Virginia in terms of volume cap and sort of the sharing and allocation and collaboration and coordination on volume cap for housing projects. So kudos to the folks at Housing and Treasury and the legislature for that fix. It was viewed, I think, initially as fairly technical, but I think it's going to have positive long-term impacts on that. Okay, that's sort of setting the stage and just some initial groundwork for this. LIFT, the LIFT reset. We've all been spending a lot of time on this and really grateful for Natasha, not only for presenting on this today, but for showing great, really tremendous leadership in terms of outreach and coordination and collaboration as we work through those issues to do the LIFT reset. So, Natasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Need to adjust microphone speaking. It's nice to be with you all today. And so I think, Mike, you've done an incredible job of laying this foundation of the environment of the various winds that we are up against. One of them, most certainly kind of at the foundation of it all, is the incredible need for housing that we see all across the state. And I think just centering on what the impact of these housing investments really are, it's to really center and prioritize getting housing where it is needed and desperately in most situations here. So just to have a couple data points here on needs, the most recent housing needs analysis identified a need for more than 550,000 homes over the next 20 years. 140,000 of those are needed now. And that has really been the impetus and the foundation for the Governor Kotek's executive order 2023-04, which is really a production mandate to say that this need to respond to the gap in housing supply needs to be guiding our public policies, need to be guiding our investment of resources as a state. That executive order indicates 36,000 units need to be funded each year, half of which need to be for affordable, meaning under serving 80% AMI and below. So that's 18,000 units a year. We have continued to escalate production year after year. You have continued to escalate production year over year, and we have just achieved our OHCS 5-year goal of building our production pipeline from about 8,000 to 25,000, which is wonderful. And that's about 18,000 units over 5 years. So for context of the degree to which that escalation needs to continue to climb is pretty jaw-dropping. And it is also in this resource-constrained environment where we will not have access to leverage 4% tax credits and tax credit equity with all of our resources. And at the same time, we also have the governor and the legislature have used this executive order to funnel and focus resources to support housing development. And so that's where the innovate and the I can't remember the whatchamacallit ideas. Wackadoodle, thank you. The wackadoodle idea is that, we need to create and revise our process and our perspective to make sure that we're leaning into all opportunities to think creatively around this. We can do the next slide. So going back to bonding, we have relationships with many different types of bonds and flavors of bonds at the state. We have some of our gap funding and financing for affordable rental housing is actually done through state bonds of a different flavor, where those bonds are sold at the state and then they become our gap financing mechanisms. Lottery-backed bonds are often used as the source for preservation investments. Article 11Q, general obligation bonds, is what 4 biennia ago we incepted the Local Innovation and Fast Track LIFT program to fund public housing and public investments in housing, not public housing, to expand affordable housing developments. And that's a different, the constitutional authority tied to that Article 11Q bond is very specific about how that needs to be conducted. And we'll get a little bit into how that has been navigated in the recent year as that process has been updated and refined. We also work in partnership with our bond council here and through our debt management group at Oregon Housing, as we've talked, as Mike was just talking about, private activity bonds. We also have the ability in the same kind of arm of practice to be able to use 501c3 bonds, which both have that tax-exempt rate advantage. Go to the next slide. So in terms of the LIFT investment from the legislature, this has been a tremendously impactful program with over 6,000 units of affordable rental housing funded. I think that's upwards. At the time this was captured, I think there are a couple projects have been awarded since then that bring that upwards of 65,000 units, 6,500 units that have been funded in rental housing. Next slide. And over 600 permanent supportive housing units. Our permanent supportive housing initiative that was funded through the state is also using the Article 11Q bonds for the development resources, paired and available with state investments of general fund current service level resources to support rent assistance and supportive services resources to create and foster expansion of permanent supportive housing unit that serve chronically homeless populations across the state. So these have all been really completely impactful programs, and on the foundation of being able to have an Article 11Q bond program that is able to work and balance the needs both of the states need to have ownership and operational controls as required through the constitutional requirements, along with lenders and investors that are partners with us in that resource. And so I've kind of listed out where we have landed in those revisions. We have had LIFT in place for a few biennia, and over time really needed to refocus and realign these legal agreements to make sure that as we are continuing to get this expanded investment in these Article 11Q bonds, that we weren't putting the state at risk. And so there were some heart-dropping moments in the mix of all of those conversations, but I think really have landed and are landing successful agreement on those with really clear buy-in from other lending partners, national lenders, local lenders, regional lenders that have really embraced the idea that our investment is to have affordability as a result. And so even in the case as legally into here, I think it's in the third bullet, those are the legally friendly words for saying even in the case of a financial foreclosure, The state's operating agreement persists, which means our affordability requirements stay, but that we have balance throughout the set of all of these agreements and documents, rights, controls, remedies, to make sure that the lender has sufficient control to make sure that their investment is protected, and the state has our controls in place to make sure the state's investment is protected. And that has been a really tremendous and collaborative conversation, and so many red lines. But have really landed that in a good place. And then I don't know if we want to kind of talk about what the different documents are. I'll hand it to those with the expertise.
Yeah, this is the lawyers talking. I don't see any of our friends from DOJ. This was very much a collaborative effort. Do we have any of the DOJ team members here? They threatened to come and keep me on track. Okay, Natasha, you're entitled to kick me under the table if I miss or misstate anything on this. But yeah, this again, just when we looked at the LIFT program at its inception a number of years ago on this, and you know, it really is, just by way of background, it really is a square peg in a round hole. It really is. There's just no other way to describe this. However, it's also the most efficient way for the state of Oregon to borrow for infrastructure and other financing. It's the lowest cost. It's a general obligation. And so Article 11Q is really a valuable financing tool in terms of going to the capital markets and getting the best deal, the lowest cost dollars for the state. However, 11Q is crafted for infrastructure and state investments that are, quote, owned or important, or operated by the state. And so when at the inception of the LIFT program, how do you do a privately owned affordable housing project and get to the conclusion, a reasonable, straight-faced, legal conclusion that this project, although not owned by the state, is, quote, operated by the state? So there was a lot of analysis, a lot of policy discussions, legal discussions, and everything at DOJ, outside counsel, and others to come up with a concept, not come up with a concept, to define a concept of operational control on this. And this is really the nut that everybody had to crack to make the LIFT program work. And what you're seeing as part of the program reset was just that, a revisit of what is operational control on that. We had the benefit post-LIFT inception of the City of Portland GO Housing Bond Program, which brings with its covenants, restrictions, some pre-foreclosure, some post-foreclosure terms, termination because of the funding sources and the legal issues associated with the sources of those funds. We had similar developments with respect to Metro, limitations on the ballot title and otherwise, and a lot of discussions around that. And so this wasn't a change in the rules, it was simply a revisit. What is the state getting? We bumped that LIFT funding, Natasha, in this biennium from 400 to 600 million?
Yes, and actually I think it's, 400 million to 600 million in LIFT resources and 100 million in PSH, Article 11 coupon. So I want to go to the next chart really quick. You can see that scaling up of Article 11 coupon resources over the years.
Great, I got out of order on that. So this really comes back to this concept of operational control on this, and that's really what I think the revisit was mostly about. And despite some of the pain and suffering and projects that were delayed along the way on that, I think we've landed. I believe, on behalf of my client, sometimes the success is everyone being equally unhappy. So you know, maybe that's maybe not the right measure here, but again, we've closed several deals now after the reset, and I think we've got a good working model going forward on this to make sure we balance the interests of the state, the constitutional requirement of operational control, ensuring the state's investment in affordable housing is long term. Again, consistent with the investments being made certainly by the private funders here as well. So with that, Steve, who has been in the trenches with me on the initial LIFT and the reset on the LIFT document, Steve, if you want to talk a little bit about some of those key concepts that drive the new, slightly revised and improved LIFT documents.
Thanks, Mike. Actually, you and Natasha have covered most of it already, so and you all did a much better job than I will do. But Just from the outset, just to and this has already been said, but the LIFT program is funded by the state, and the monies for the program actually come from another bonding program. The state is able to issue general obligation bonds of the state for the purposes of financing property, quote, owned or operated by the state. And as Mike notes, that this has also come to be the source of funding for the LIFT program. Most of the 11Q bonds that the state issues on an annual basis go to more traditional governmental-owned buildings. So this is a novel and innovative approach that the state of Oregon has developed to help provide these gap funding, another gap funding source for affordable housing. And as Mike and Natasha both note, the program's been in place for six years or so now, I believe. We as bond counsel to the OHCS were involved in the early development of this program, and as the program is ramped up, the state rightfully decided to take a hard look at, whether or not the program that was in place was constitutionally sound. And the good news is it is constitutionally sound. Really what's happened in terms of the reset is a number of the key documents have been refined slightly. The LIFT loan, it's the loan that comes in from the state as a gap funding source, is on parity. It's a senior debt that's on parity with the bondholder. And that's both driven by state statute, but it's also driven by this idea that to meet the constitutional requirements, the state's got to have some operational control over the project. Remember, this is a project that is, technically owned by a limited partnership or an LLC. And so the way you obtain the operational control is through the department's documents, its operating agreement, as well as this sort of first lien position that the state shares with the bondholder. Now that's, a good thing for the state. It has to be sort of, negotiated with the bondholders, and that's the process that Natasha just described. And the way that works is the state enters into an intercreditor agreement with the bond investor, and they essentially sort of divide the rights and responsibilities and remedies available to them. And that's really changed very little since the beginning of this. But the one thing that came out of this process has been some clarity around confirming that, if in the worst case scenario a project were to fail and it went into foreclosure, the state is able to retain its ability to ensure that the project remains an affordable housing community. And that's really, I think, the most important thing that came out of this process. That was largely already there. It's now there for certain. It's what the state is bargaining for, as Natasha notes, and it's also what ensures that this program stays on a constitutionally sound footing going forward. I think beyond that, there's a lot of lawyerly technical details that if anybody ever wants to talk about them, we can discuss. But really the main point about all of this is that the department has been able to sort of ensure its right to remain in this operational control position, even following the worst case scenario of foreclosure. It retains the right to negotiate transfer and sale of the project. It retains the right to ensure affordability. And as Natasha notes, the good news about all of this is that the lenders in a number of deals since the reset have gotten comfortable with this, and the project and the program is moving forward. So, Mike, is there anything else you think I should cover?
That's a great summary, Steve.
All right.
And we do have on our website, and you might just want to ask me for the link, but I'm sure it was in a technical advisory. We do have all of the current draft documents posted, and as those become templates, we'll kind of continue to have some more projects closed, but as they become templates, we will make sure to keep those transparent and clear and be able to really speak to the why of each of those mechanics. And so as all of our state investments, we have the executive order in place, we have amazing investments in housing expansion. So we have $600 million in Article 11Q bonds, permanent supportive housing resources also in Article 11Q bonds. We received $550 million, wish it were 500, for preservation activities. An additional new $10 million to support housing for ag workers specifically, and then also $9.7 million to start a new pre-development program. And I think just thinking about the landscape of resources and where we want to make sure that we are moving things forward in this place where we already have projects standing in line ready to use all of the 2024 private activity bond allocation. And so that is, going back to, as Mike was talking about, our recent bond bill will give us $450 million directly to OHCS that we'll be able to access and program in partnership with the housing authorities. We have put in place into our qualified allocation plan the competitive structure for that 4% for that private activity bond allocation, moving from a place where it was essentially an open door for any project to come in and find a place on that closing calendar that worked, and we would be able to go through and usher that process, and then we are at the ceiling. So we are at this place where between prior funded Article 11Q bond projects and Metro bond funded projects and Housing Authority projects and Portland bond funded projects, this 2024 calendar is already full. And we have a full slate of resources to be able to put out as we get into the new year. And so how do we, as a collective, get to a place where we are able to deploy all of these resources, knowing that all of them will not be able to leverage that 4% tax credit and the private equity that comes with it. And so I think that's where, as we're thinking about creative strategies in the second session, thinking about other bonding strategies to get favorable debt resources into projects, and then how do we think about piecemealing resources that we have together to continue to make the broad impact, to be able to really serve all areas of the state. And that might mean some smaller projects, that might be different phases of projects and financial structures and creative solutions in here, to be able to make sure that we're continuing to able to deploy resources out into community as we do this. And and so part of our intentionality at OHCS is, as I'm sure several of you are following along with us, as we are working to revamp and update our funding process to step away from a place of different lanes of resources, having different offerings and rules and requirements, and instead trying to create a centralized application process that will hopefully land us in a place where not only can we be deploying these pre-development resources to support our culturally specific development partners and small nonprofits who don't have access or opportunity for that upfront investment in their projects to be able to build their own internal pipelines, but also make sure that when you have that crazy idea that it ends up with balanced sources and uses, that there's a place to come in and we can assemble that creative solution with you to say, okay, we've never seen that other funding source, but look, we have this structure where we can take a piece of these things and put them together to be that complementary solution. Part of our other intention here is to also stand up for those as you are exploring your whatchamacallit ideas. That's what I'm going to call it from now on. Wackadoodle, okay.
Technical legal term.
Okay, legally it's called wackadoodle. As you come up with your wackadoodle solutions, to have an established team of technical advisors that will be there to actually have a deliberate role to talk to you about those ideas. I know that many folks know that they can track down Ty and get some good ideas, or Alan or Hattie around the room, but I think they're balancing all of these other things on their plate at the same time, and just wanting to make sure that we have a group of folks that is intentionally there to bounce ideas off, give you feedback and help usher into our process to make it make sense and do that any translation of your wackadoodle into how can we fit this into programmatic fits. And so really ideally that revised structure, which is is a little, change is scary. And it is the time to make this change because we need to make sure that these resources can have the best impact across the state. And surely many of them will end up being leveraged with 4% in tax credits, and most with positive surety, not all of them will be able to be. And I think we're trying to approach that strategically, kind of recast our base infrastructure here to be able to have a place where we can contemplate different combinations and different puzzle pieces here to make the development resources align with the work that you're doing in community. So I think that's it for my slides.
Okay. Thanks, Natasha. I've got some other material I want to cover here, but let's maybe pause there. That's a lot of information. We've talked about competitive volume cap. We've talked about the LIFT program and a host of other things. Let's pause there and see if we've got some questions. Yes?
Talk about the federal measure to reduce the. Sure. Could you talk about the federal measure to reduce the 50% test to 25% and what impact that would have on private activity bonds? And then also talk about the politics around that, where that stands in the federal government as a decision.
I know just enough to be dangerous, so I will just, with that qualifier, I'll share with you how it would operate technically on this. I know last year at this time there was a fairly high level of optimism that we would get a 25% test instead of a 50% test. So let me just kind of back up a little bit here in terms of how this works and just kind of a 101 for tax credits on this. So in order to generate tax credits from a private activity bond, more than 50% of your project costs need to be financed with tax-exempt bonds, okay? Now, in almost all cases, and Jessica, I don't want to steal your thunder about recycling cap. We're going to talk about this. In almost all cases, that 50% tax-exempt bond amount is significantly higher than the amount of the senior debt the project will actually support. So if you reduce the 50% test to 25% test, you will have much greater alignment in terms of the amount of tax-exempt bonds issued and the amount of senior debt that the project will actually support. So what we see, and this is the recycling conversation we're going to have in the next session, is a lot of cap. We used to refer to it as burning cap, but it's just cap that only gets used on a short-term basis. Obviously, if we have a 25% test, we can issue a lot more bonds and generate a lot more tax credits. I think the other piece that we heard on that was, well, that's a lot more tax credit. What's the capacity out there in terms of CRA and other driven investments to invest in those tax credits? So I think if we had seen that last year, it would have two things. One, we would have had a capacity to issue a lot more private activity bonds and generate tax credits. But it also meant that we would probably, the speculation, we would have seen a fairly significant decrease in the economics and the pricing of those tax credits just because there were so many more of those available on that. I can't really speak to the politics of it other than, gosh, it just seems like such a reasonable idea. And why aren't we doing that when we've got this sort of archaic structure where we issue bonds on a short-term basis with lots of costs and complexity associated with that debt issuance just to generate the tax credits and comply with some very technical rules that really has no relationship to the actual amount of long-term tax-exempt debt that a project will support. Natasha, you may have some ideas on the politics of it, or policy.
I don't know that they're wise ideas. But yeah, I mean, I think I think housing, if we think about, where do politics land us today? I do think that housing and the need for housing and serving your populations with housing is and should be a bipartisan issue, but I think it then, gets put into bipartisan camps. And so I think that ends up being the place of that decision making. But I think, as Mike is saying, the impact is you would get to do nearly double the projects, not exactly, because you want to have some cushion to make sure you meet your either 50% or 25% test, but that we would surely see a lot less of that short-term use of resources, and that the private activity bonds would be the kind of more scaled to the type of the amount of permanent debt that you're able to hold on those projects. And in that mix, if there was a project that needed 40% debt on their project, there would likely need to be some blending and some creative bond issuance strategies, but those are well practiced, I think.
Other questions? Competitive criteria for volume cap allocation. No questions? Okay. So I think, the transition from our non-competitive program into the competitive environment raised a lot of huge questions in here. And I think some of the, I think Mike started off talking about the bond bill and the shifts that we made in there, both to have $450 million of the private activity bond come to OHCS to manage, but also the place where we established within there in the statute, OHCS's ability to suballocate that private activity bond to housing authorities to also do issuance where that made sense. And our practice at this point, and kind of has been memorialized over time, is that where the state is not putting another gap financing, we are agnostic as to who issues the bonds. So that might be if it's a housing authority project, the housing authority could issue the bonds. And traditionally, the housing authorities in those circumstances would get that private activity bond allocation directly from the Private Activity Bond Council or Committee. And so in terms of contemplating this big shift, we realized that if we are going to kind of want to focus on having the private activity bonds come to OHCS so that we have certainty to be able to program this limited resource, we needed to keep the housing authorities in partnership in that, because by doing so, by directing the private activity bonds through the state agency, through the State Housing Finance Agency, we would be removing them from that PABC space where the housing authorities had traditionally gone. And so I think I just expressed extreme gratitude to the housing authorities of Oregon for really engaging in earnest in that conversation with us. Again, shifts and changes are all hard to anticipate the consequences of, but really want to balance our role as the kind of central state agency around affordable housing investments and the role that housing authorities play across the state in serving communities with housing. And so I think that is both the kind of premise behind the why of some of those big pivots. And as we implemented our competitive structure for private activity bonds and 4% credits, really stepped away from the idea of an extensive competition and really more into a place of prioritization. And so prioritizing first projects that are owned by housing authorities, secondly, projects that have significant local investment in them, so like Metro bond investment, Portland bond investments, and then thirdly to other OHCS funded projects. And so I do think, this is a learning experience. This is our first time moving this program into a competitive space for the state. And it's also our first time putting in place a competitive structure that is prioritization, not scored. And I think, as we are doing this, and it is working, and it is addressing some of the most acute kind of critical pinch points that we identified of needing to be in alignment and supporting jurisdictions who are putting their resources to their housing investments and housing authorities that are doing that critical work on the backbone of housing across the state. And I think one of the pieces that we will need to be looking and solving for is how do we
provide more certainty around timing when we are making investments that are leveraging and intended to leverage that 4% tax credit. And so acknowledge and identify that as we land different steps of a piece of this puzzle, I am committed to continue a process refinement and reflection, identifying what are the gaps that we have created unintentionally, and how do we work to solve those, and still provide this transparent clarity. And so I think there are a lot of different levers in that conversation, but it is, it is the place of that 4% tax credit and private activity bonds being competitive. Unless there is federal reform, we are kind of left without a solution besides needing to have it competitive. But I feel like, feel confident that we landed it, at least in this first iteration so far, in a place where we're really trying to prioritize these public partnerships with all of these other housing producers across the state, and also recognize that there's more to come in that conversation, not to challenge the current agreement, but to refine them so that the process works together instead of being a little bit out of sequence. I'm seeing some nods, so if you have great ideas, let me know.
That's great information, Natasha. Thank you. Any other questions for the moment? Yes, Jill.
I had to ask this. As you know, for some of the local jurisdictions, I'm in Portland, so we have a number of bonds and local resources. When you say significant resources, is that prioritization going to continue for 2024 and 2025 and going forward?
It is continuing for 2024. We're currently working to program our 2024, and I don't expect that we're going to step away from that, but I do think we will likely need a qualified allocation plan update before deploying 2025 resources, just given all of our other process updates to reflect that. So am I hopeful that we refine it a little bit for 2025? Yes. Do I think that means stepping away from the prioritization? I don't know. I do not think that I'm interested in that.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to just give some Natasha's given you really practical, pragmatic, boots on the ground advice. I'm going to just do a little speculation here as we wrap up part one here on this, and that is, what are we seeing? What's trending? I'm not sure anything's a trend just yet. I can tell you about some of the conversations we're having as a bond counsel firm and a firm that does a lot of affordable housing work on this. When I give the affordable housing finance speech to either new associates or at a really, really basic level on this, I always talk about the three-legged stool. You got one leg of the stool is your senior debt or your bonds. What will the project support long-term in terms of debt? The second leg of the stool is low-income housing tax credits. And the third leg of the stool is the gap funding. And that's where all the magic happens. As you all know, it's all in the gap funding. So what do you do when you've got a two-legged stool because the LIHTC is just not there? How do you fill that gap? And that's where innovation, creativity, sharpening your pencil, lawyers don't do math. That's what you all get to do on that. So what's trending? Our internal group, our housing group at Orrick, work in a number of states on this. We've captioned our conversations beyond LIHTC. We're still going to do a lot of tax credit bond, private activity bond deals. We love doing that work. It's great to see these projects get done, resources leveraged on that. But how do you do projects how do you get beyond LIHTC? If you don't have LIHTC, how do you do that project? And so in terms of how we're kind of thinking about this in our shop, from a legal structuring, financing standpoint on this, we tend to sort of think of these projects on a continuum. You've got supportive housing or permanent supportive housing, PSH, kind of at one end of the spectrum, and then you've got market rate stuff, which never qualifies for tax-exempt bond financing on the other end of the spectrum, and then you've got this stuff in the middle. we've done several projects where supportive housing, where the project simply doesn't support any debt, no debt at all. It's got to have all soft money and tax credits and other resources in it. So the bonds are simply issued, meet the 50% test, paid off at conversion, go away, no senior secured amortizing senior debt on the project. And we've seen that on a number of projects. The bonds are just a bridge to the tax credit equity for the project. We've also seen projects, interestingly, where the project itself did not support debt through rents, but the project sponsor or an affiliate, in one case a city, a large city, said, I need to do this project, and rather than just fund it with a full faith and credit bond, I'm going to issue a revenue bond, and I'm going to put it into a tax credit structure, and we'll just pay the debt service from our balance sheet. It was a highly rated city, so they did a tax credit deal with the debt service not tied to the credit of the project. So kind of cool. Then affordable projects in Oregon, 100% at 60 or below. That's kind of the standard measure, and some 30% units and other things to be competitive. That's not what the federal tax code requires, and we'll talk about that in the next session, about some flexibility around affordability covenants for tax-exempt financing on that. But when we talk about affordable, typically in Oregon, we mean 100% of units at 60% or below. Mixed income. Gosh, I wish there was a magic bullet on mixed income on this. It's hard. You all know it's hard. You've got competing processes, reporting requirements, different capital stack sources tied to uses. It's complex. I think of the projects that we've done over the years. Most often when we've done a mixed income, it's been affordable and then a separate condominium or other structure for the workforce, and workforce really meant 80% AMI and not higher than that. But they're tough. They're hard to do. They're good projects. They create some, there's lots of good policy reasons you want to do those projects, but we acknowledge that they're really hard. Where we're having a lot of conversations, where we're spending our time, and is really in the workforce middle housing space. And again, this is a pitch for the part 2 of this discussion is around that. But special purpose 501c3 entities doing middle housing, eligible for tax-exempt financing, possibly property tax exemption, subject to state by state on that. But we're really seeing an interest in moving to the middle in terms of projects that don't have LIHTC. You've got to have higher rents to support higher debt levels on that. So we're seeing a strong trend towards moving to the middle on projects. And that's from developers who are traditional affordable housing developers, who aren't getting cap allocations or are concerned about getting cap and LIHTC allocations on the one hand. So they're pushing projects and saying, what if I go to 80? Or, and they're working on their pro formas to see how they make a project work in terms of additional soft debt or other sorts of resources in terms of filling that LIHTC hole, if you would, to do those projects. The other thing that we're seeing, which is really interesting, is we're seeing some market rate developers going, oh, what's actually market rate? What's workforce? What's the need in my community? Not to do an affordable project, but to do a middle project under a special purpose 501c3 and say, if my market here is really in the 80 to 120% AMI, and I can get tax-exempt financing in a rising rate environment or other incentives around workforce housing, maybe what I need to do is move to the middle from the other side, from market to middle versus affordable to middle. We're having some really interesting conversations. I wish I could tell you I'd closed that deal last week, but I haven't closed that deal yet. The bankers and the underwriters and the developers are all still doing the math on those deals. But that's clearly the trend that we're seeing, is a move to the middle, either mixed or middle or workforce or those things. And again, that's a little precursor for where we'll be spending some more time in the second hour on this. I think as Natasha said, we've got $600 million of 11Q funding this year between LIFT and PSH. How are we going to deploy those dollars? We've had 400 in the last biennium and a lot more volume cap, bond 4% capacity. We don't have that going forward, so I know that's an area where the department's spending a lot of time. We're all noodling. We're trying to do our homework and understand best practice about how LIFT gets paired. LIFT and, frankly, a whole range of other gap funding resources gets paired with optimal senior debt financing to maximize those projects. It's an interesting time, and wackadoodle's not a legal term or anything like that, but I really want to make a pitch for innovation. If you have ideas, if you're working on that pro forma, if you're looking at tax-exempt financing opportunities, let's have that conversation and figure out what might work. We're seeing some really interesting developments across the country right now in terms of moving to the middle. And I don't think that means it's sort of an all or nothing, that you have to abandon the affordable mission. Maybe it's just getting smarter about how we put mixed income projects together, how we move the needle a little bit in terms of a broader range, addressing a broader range of need in terms of our targeted residents on that to create a stronger capital stack, increasing our borrowing capacity, and otherwise putting all the pieces together for a transaction. We've got 8 minutes left, and that kind of finishes up phase one. Natasha, anything we missed? Words of wisdom? No pressure.
So many thoughts. Started taking notes on different middle income ideas. But I do think, it's these creative solutions. I think it will be interesting to see what ongoing legislative conversations and investments look like. I don't think the housing conversation is done, which is exciting and is an opportunity to continue to push and move it where ideally, where we think it will be most impactful in resulting in solid operating housing in and across community. And also just, in the mix of all of these wins and trends, need to acknowledge that that's the upfront costs. It's also the ongoing operating costs that we know projects are up against. Portfolios are struggling. And, as we look to these new generations of projects that we're funding, need to make sure that we're putting structures in place that are going to allow those projects to be resilient and successful in the long term. And so, it's a lot of balancing that needs to happen here. And I think, there's something to think about in terms of that long-term resiliency. What does a mixed income project look like versus exclusively affordable? How do we expand the availability of units that can support those at 0 to 30 and 40 and 50 while making those have some, I want to not just keep saying resilient, but have budgets and operating resources in hand to do the work and make the community connections that those tenants are, needing and seeking. And so I think it is, continually leaning in again to that creative space, the problem-solving space. There is no part of me that doesn't believe the development community is not the most creative problem solvers in the mix of things. And just know that, I think the more, as we are embracing trying to think about different strategies, there was a time when we were closing 4 and 5, 4% projects a year. And that was kind of seen as what that program did. And y'all have proven that that's not what that program does. And so I think there's all the hope in the universe that there are so many other solutions out there that will prove what we didn't think was going to happen can happen. And so I think, I think that there's the power of everybody's brain power, some very on-board legal counsel to kind of pursue the wackadoodle. And I think we want to just be at the state willing partners to explore and be curious and get to the balanced sources and uses.
Yes, balanced sources and uses. Okay, so in wrapping up, yes, question?
Yeah, thanks. I actually had more of a comment and less of a question, if you'll humor me. So I love the ideas that we're talking about. I think mixed income is a fantastic option. I know that OHCS has Housing Stability Council, which is one way that y'all get commentary. I know you have a very robust group of developers and sponsors in this room. When it comes to things like mixed income, operating expenses, kind of the next 2 to 3, 4, 5 years, I would encourage you to think about talking to some more bankers and equity partners, mixed income can be a third rail depending on how you structure it and where you're structuring it. And so I think there are ways that you can bring folks like this table, for the most part, to your table to make sure that the ideas that you're thinking about the developers think are wonderful, that then do not become ideas that we cannot finance, particularly, and I'm going to say a buzzword that's going to make people either drink or do something else in these unprecedented times in the equity market. So thanks.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to do a shameless pitch for my firm and my partners. While we're talking about moving beyond LIHTC and doing bond 4% deals, those are still the baseline. And we're still going to do a lot of those transactions. We've got, almost $500 million of cap to utilize and deploy on an annual basis. And I know our team at OHCS is going to do it in a thoughtful way. We have a nice little sleep aid here called Multifamily Rental Housing Financing with Tax-Exempt Bonds. It's a great primer for those of you who aren't familiar with this space. Basic structures, terminology, and otherwise. We've got a couple hard copies. You can scan it and have electronically as well. It's not an audiobook, no. Although I think Alex is committed to give it some kind of a musical anecdote to lead us in on it. So we're still working on that, but it's a nice resource. So if you'd like to have that, you can access that. So that's a nice piece on that. And then also, not to get ahead of ourselves, but we do have this is a Green Book series that Orrick puts out, and I have actually seen the draft of the Middle Housing Green Book primer, which is due the first quarter of next year. So anyway, it's a great resource and a nice summary for those of you who aren't super familiar with the area on that. So make that shameless pitch. And with that, unless there's other questions, we will wrap up and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Thanks, everyone.